Welcome to the Modern Day Naturopath Podcast with Dr. Sue. Real talk for those craving deep healing whilst living in a modern day society. You'll be equipped with knowledge to make profound mind-body shifts that utilize ancient wisdom and will facilitate your healing once and for all. Inspired by Dr. Sue's chronic illness journey and all the real and raw pearls she has learned along the way. Come as you are. It's never too late to start.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Sue. Welcome. I'm so excited to be here today. This is the first episode of my podcast, The Modern Day Naturopath. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic of overcoming trauma. And there is no one better to do this with than my dear friend, Dr. Nicole Cain, because of how special she has been in my own journey, which we're going to talk about today. Dr. Nicole Cain is a colleague of mine. I met her over 10 years ago in naturopathic medical school. She ran a clinical shift, and I would request to be on her shift as often as possible to be able to soak in all of her brilliance. She was so specialized in mind-body medicine, and it fascinated me. So I want to welcome her today. Thank you so much for joining.
I'm absolutely honored to be here, and congratulations on this being your first episode.
Thank you.
Everybody
so
who's
much.
listening, by the way, this
God.
has been a long time coming. So many people have been asking Dr. Sue, like, when are you going to create a podcast? There's so much brilliance that's hard to get out in like a Instagram reel and like a 60-second, 90-second clip. So I just want to shout out to you that we're like here and doing this.
Oh, thank you. So I know. I said, oh my goodness, this has literally been years coming. And one day I just woke up and I'm like, today is the day. And I was on Dr. Nicole's podcast and it inspired me. I'm like, okay, I have to do my own now. And also I want to remind you guys, Dr. Nicole Cain does have an Instagram page, amazing information. Press pause, go follow her, Dr. Nicole Cain, Cain on Instagram. And so today, this is a personal type of topic to me because I have experienced my own trauma, and this involves a level of vulnerability that's very scary. And so over the years, I went back and forth with, do I share some of these personal things that, are really scary to talk about, but then when I would get an outpouring of people saying, I feel seen, I feel heard, at that point I realized, okay, even though this is uncomfortable, this can be healing both ways, right? I can heal by sharing a story and other people can say, oh, wow, I didn't know that I actually had those tools available, or I didn't even know I could heal at that capacity, right? So because of Dr. Nicole Cain's help with a very dark place in my own life, today I wanted to share as the first episode to help empower you guys. So before I share my story, is there anything, Dr. Nicole, that you want to share about being vulnerable?
I think that there is so much power in story. And I think about our ancestors and how before we even had written word that humans differentiated themselves in many ways, but most importantly, I think, is through story, the story of who we are, the story of our family, the story of our experiences. And so story is woven into our DNA. And I think about the beginning of psychology and counseling, where it just began with being able to share and tell our story. And it's a gift to speak it. We could go into the neuroscience on that in a future episode, but it's also a gift to hear and to feel understood, like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. So I honor you for being vulnerable with your story.
Thank you. And tell us, speaking of vulnerability, how did you start getting into this mind-body medicine? What made you decide to delve into that psych world that you are so good at? What actually inspired that?
I think it was a journey of necessity, in that I come from, on both sides of my maternal and my paternal side of the family, a lot of complex trauma, a lot of intergenerational trauma. And my role coming into the family in many ways was the peacemaker. My job, I felt growing up, was to take care of my parents, to try to make them happy or less depressed or calm their anger or to help them feel good about themselves. And I had a fanny pack in 3rd grade. It's like funny little fanny pack, and it contained all of these because it's very concrete, right? Just so the child's brain is very black and white, very concrete. And I was like, I can fix
Mhm.
people if I have a fanny pack with a Band-Aid and gauze. And so when I started out, I was reading first aid books. I wanted to be a doctor. I was the wounded healer. I wanted to be at least. And by the time I entered college, I was on 6 different prescriptions for all sorts of health issues that were coming up. And I was getting no healthier. In fact, I was getting worse. And anxiety was becoming a big
Mhm.
picture thing because with anxiety, it's there's powerless. Like humans want control, connection, and they want to have power. We want to have personal power over our lives. And I didn't have that. And I felt like I had given it up, to relinquished my power to the authorities that be. And I didn't want to
Yeah.
be that kind of an authority anymore. I didn't want to be a doctor. So I went to counseling school. I got my master's in clinical psychology. And I remember, Sue, I've probably told you this story before. I was a counselor in a group rehab with adolescents in Lake Forest, Illinois, north of Chicago in the suburbs there. And it was 8 o'clock at night, and we had adolescents coming in for rehab. And so there was drug addiction, and we were working with them on all sorts of substances. One thing that I did, just as an aside, is we'd have to go in a circle and talk about, like, my name is blah blah blah, my drug of choice is X, Y, and Z, and I've been sober X amount of days. And I would always say, oh, I'm Nicole Cain, my drug of choice is life. And then like 15 adolescents would roll their eyes so hard I was worried they'd fall out of their chairs. But because that's
You said, wait, so they would ask you, "What is your drug of choice?"
oh, so
And you said
annoying.
life, and they were they
They're
were
like,
they were pissed. They were like, "What? Who is
this
this fairy,
obnoxious,
and where did she come from?"
annoying fairy. But what sticks out and where everything changed is there's this one girl, and I can see her in my mind's eye, and she has a giant caffeinated drink in her hand, something like a Red Bull or a Monster drink. Remember, it's 8 o'clock at night, and
Mhm.
her drug of choice was cocaine,
Mhm.
and she wasn't
Mhm.
sober. And while we were talking in the group, her main complaint, her main issue at that moment was that she's struggling with insomnia. She couldn't sleep. And so I'm looking at her, I'm kind of side eyeing her, and I'm like, well, you're on cocaine. That's going to screw with your sleep. You're chugging caffeinated beverages in the evening. That's going to screw with your sleep. But it was out of my scope to talk about diet, lifestyle, and things like that. And so we had to send her to a psychiatrist who gave her Ambien, which is a controlled substance, a sedative. And so now we
Mhm.
have this teenager who's developing brain is on all these drugs. And I was like, I can't be a part of this system. This is awful. I I got on
No
Google.
way. And wait, you weren't able as a counselor even to just give basic, like, nutrition advice, or that
It
was completely
might
out of
have
scope
it was out of
for a therapist?
scope for where I was. I was working at Rush Behavioral Health. And I think maybe, a lot of counselors now would suggest, like, maybe you talk to your doctor about whether or not the Red Bull is affecting your sleep.
Right. Right. Right, 'cause sometimes it could just be
Mhm.
something like that, and you would love to be able to
Just here, let's
share.
print
Okay,
out
continue.
this
Yeah.
WebMD article on caffeine and sleep.
Yeah,
But we sent her to
yeah,
a psychiatrist, and I sent
yeah.
myself to Google, and I discovered SENM, which is the now Sonoran University. But when Dr. Sue and I graduated from there, it was Sonora or SENM. And I went to medical school, and I'm almost done with the story. I feel like this is a long story, but I
No,
went
I
to
love
medical
it.
school. Not to, yeah, we're gonna brag. I'm gonna pat myself in the back. I kicked ass in
Yeah.
medical school.
I know, we
I
always
wanna
say I
brag.
don't wanna brag, and then I'm
I'm
like,
gonna
"Maybe I'm
brag.
gonna brag." Like, "This
We're
is
gonna own
really
it.
hard.
Yeah, it
This
was
is
really
really
hard.
hard."
And
Exactly.
I just kicked ass. in medical school. I did a residency and I went into private practice, doing amazing until the dark circle of hell, which is my story of
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
horrific panic and anxiety. And it was at that moment where I realized that everything that I knew about healing anxiety was wrong. And I had to reinvent it from the ground up. And that became my life's work, my life's mission. And I wrote a book about it. It's coming out this fall. We're recording this in 2024 and it's coming out. And so, you know,
So
we have
exciting.
the opportunity to grow and to evolve and to leverage our experiences into something that gives us power, control, and connection, or be be burned alive by them and to give up. And I chose to fight and continue fighting. And I see that in you, Sue. And it's just so that's my jam. That's why I'm here.
Wow. I knew chunks of that story, but I didn't know from the beginning to the end of that story. The fanny pack is just,
Fanny pack.
oh, I know. And it's like, and also having to be the parent when you're a child, right? I mean, so many people can really, I have patients who share what that has done to them. And so, my last question for you about your journey is, did you go through that kind of like dark night of the soul as a student, or was this after you
After I
graduated?
graduated, I did
Okay. So yeah, because
yeah,
as a
I did
student.
well with the
Mhm.
control of medical school. It's like you are receiving student loans. Sally Mae, who's now Navient, wasn't breathing down my back.
I hated
Sally
Sally
Mae.
Mae.
Oh, I need to.
She would call me. I had her in my phone, so I would know who she was. So I didn't pick up, and Sally Mae would call me all day, and I'd be like, I don't want to hear from
She was
Sally ever again.
harassing you, right? She was
She harassed you. If you were like 4 hours late on a loan payment, Sally
Sally.
called you.
She
I
had
can't.
her
Oh my
henchmen
god.
coming. So
Right?
I did really well as a student. Like I could be a student for life. I loved it. There's structure and there's control, but one thing that can happen in trauma is that things you have to adapt to every single thing that does or does not happen to us. And so when those adaptations are batched and
Mm.
etched out for you and you have a clear plan, that's easier. But then when you're just sort of thrust into the real world and you feel like you're just like, you're just falling, free falling, that for me at least was really challenging. And that's where things started to really destabilize.
Yeah, because even watching you, if I look back, even watching you in school, it seemed like you were in your elements. Like you loved the routine, you loved the structure. Where some of us, it was like crippling us, and you love that like structure, right? Because I feel like it's also safe, right? It makes you feel safe when there's structure and
Yes.
routine, right? So then when you get out of that, oh my God, thank you for sharing that story from beginning to end. Because like I said, I didn't know the pieces in between. And so now you've been helping people, including
Yeah.
myself, which I want to share a
Yeah.
little bit about. So, speaking of a vulnerable story, so just as Nicole explained about being on all these different psychiatric meds. I remember since 17 years old, my symptoms were I'm anxious, I'm nauseous, my head hurts, I'm dizzy, and I'm tired. And it would just perpetuate every single year. And then the medical doctors would say, here's Wellbutrin, add it to your Prozac. Oh, here's Trazodone, add it to this. And then I'll never forget in Italian, like stunada is like stupid, like loopy head stupid. My dad used to be like, you like a stunada all the time. Like I couldn't feel. And to me at that point, that felt amazing, right? Because I didn't want to feel those anxious thoughts. But now looking back, right, feeling, right, we can't go through life and experience joy, right, if we don't feel. So throughout all those years, I went to probably hundreds of doctors and then started doing holistic doctors. And I was in advertising at the time. So I had, Manhattan to, where I can get all of these different cool, new, innovative doctors, and not one person could really help me. And then it was Dr. Sensenig, our very dear mentor, who actually let me shadow, and I watched miracles happen in that office. And I said, that's it. I'm changing my career, moved to Arizona. And throughout that time, a business major in medical school, it was quite the road. And by the grace of God, I finished. But through the end of school, the pain and the migraines and the exhaustion and the body pain and anxiety just got crippling. And I remember taking my boards with my literally like my hand on, like laying with my hand on the desk, reading the paper. Like I couldn't keep my head up. I had like severe neurological pain and burning in my brain, like actual brain on fire. And then I graduated. I was like, thank you, God. Thank you, Jesus. I graduated. I moved back to New York. I'm like, I'm going to start this practice. Yet I was literally debilitated with pain. And so at that point, I found a Lyme literate medical doctor in Manhattan. He did a lot of therapies from Germany, and it was very expensive. It was very invasive, but I almost felt like my family felt like there was no other choice. I was either going to come out of medical school and not practice because I was so sick, or I'm going to do something radical. So I did. And I remember after the 3 months was over, why did I not feel better? Why do I still feel so sick? And although he would say, listen, you had, I don't think it's actually shared. I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, undiagnosed for probably over 20 years. Did this very intense treatment. And the medical doctor at the end said, listen, it's going to take your body a while to heal because you've had neurological Lyme untreated for a very long time. However, and this is the most probably profound moment of my life and healing, he said, there's a spiritual, emotional issue going on. And I could tell he was an older doctor, and I could tell he was very intuitive. And he said, I really suggest, in order for you to heal, you have to see a shaman. And I was quite shocked because he was a medical doctor, and I had nothing against shamans. I just didn't expect to hear that. So when a medical doctor says to see a shaman, you see a shaman. Because you're like, there must be some type of maybe message he's getting, intuition he's getting. And so long story short, I found someone that was from Arizona. I unfortunately was in New York. So I begged her, could you just do a Skype visit with me? Something's better than nothing. And I remember she asked me, I want you to stand as your adult self and look at your 5-year-old self. But instead of looking down at her, get on your knees and look straight in her eyes and ask her, why does my head hurt so bad? And at that moment, I had a flashback of my childhood trauma. And I hadn't remembered probably the first, I would say, at least 8 years of my life, which goes back to Dr. Cain because she taught a psychology class in medical school. And she said to us, if you ask your patient about their childhood and they say they don't remember before the age of 7, they likely have trauma. And I remember that day in school, I was like, well, that's interesting, because me and my friend next to me, we both raised our hands when she said, who doesn't remember before the age of 7? And so at that moment, I had this connection. And at that point, I went back and forth in denial. Okay, this couldn't have happened. I'm hallucinating. I'm crazy. There's no way. The bargaining, this can't be. And then saw a psychologist, saw a therapist, and they said, based on your physical and, mental, emotional symptoms, this checks out. And so at that time, I started really doing a lot of energy medicine. I tried to finally share it with my family, who thankfully, by the grace of God, believed me, because a lot of trauma victims or survivors, I should say, are not believed. And long story short, I remember one night I was in bed and I just couldn't sleep. It was flashbacks, and I couldn't sleep then the second night. And then, 500 herbs later, vitamins, nervines, and all these beautiful herbs that are supposed to calm your nervous system and make you sleep. Nothing helped me. And now by night 3, of not sleeping because of these flashbacks and going through this. Basically, I would say had like a nervous break, right? I couldn't process that this actually happened because I was only 32 when I saw this. And so at that point, that's when I said, I need to talk to Dr. Nicole Cain. She needs to take me on as a patient. I sent her a message. Please help me. I am in a very bad situation. It was getting very dark. Can you please help me out of this darkness? And so that was the moment when we started speaking about pharmaceuticals and its place in crisis situations. And I feel like her help here helped me not only accept that I am also a human and I'm not just a naturopath that has to do extremist things and always just use herbs. And I was so passionate about naturopathic medicine that I forgot that I too was a human and having a really terrible experience. And so it was at that moment where said, okay, we need to use pharmaceutical intervention here because you've used the other stuff. It's not working, but we will combine it, right, with these holistic therapies. And then you will eventually be free of that. You won't need to take that anymore. And so I trusted her. And I'm going to let Dr. Nicole share more about crisis. But that was the first moment that I said, okay, I accept that I too need help. And it may not just be with something naturopathic. And this was my biggest learning lesson to help patients, because if I was so extremist in one direction and I never allowed for that human, right, to be humanized, then I don't think I would have been able to see my patients the way I do now.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that story. And I know I personally resonate with you, and I feel that. And I think you're so brave for being open about that. And I imagine that there's a lot of people listening that are going to say, oh my God, I feel seen. And I also really want to honor that and I remember you were like, I want to do it right. You're like, I want to do the exercise. I want to do the counseling. I want to do the spiritual work. I want to do the herbs. You were looking at, and you're so brilliant. Like, I know your brain. You're like studying the mechanisms and the biochemistry and the science and the methylation and the detox. You and I've had lots of conversations about that. And I really honor that you came to this place of balance, because I think that there's a gift in complementary medicine as opposed to fundamentalism, where it's like, I will only do this or only do that. And that's part of my own story, is that I was in the red light crisis zone and I was using maybe green or yellow light interventions. And so then that in itself is traumatizing, because you don't have power. You're doing everything that you think is going to help. And when it doesn't work, every single day that you wake up and it's worse and you have continued sheer panic, it's like stealing your power bit by bit until you feel completely helpless.
Exactly.
I honor that. And this is when we have the gift of smart pharmacology, is that and I know a lot of people in the mental health world talk about semicolons, where it's like, this is not the end of my story. This is a semicolon. And
right. Oh, I love that. This is a semicolon.
A lot of patients, they get it tattooed
amazing.
right on their wrist, and they're like, this is the semicolon moment. And that was,
oh, I love that. I actually never heard that.
It's so good.
See, I always learn something from your brain. I've never heard that before, but that's perfect. And you know what? This just reminded me. I remember Dr. Sensenik, who we absolutely adored, our mentor. I remember when I was 20 something years old and I had gone to him, and he was treating me at the time for parasites and the herbs weren't working. And he goes, Susan, you're suffering. This is not a religion. Just take the drug. Like, you'll be fine. We'll recover you after. Like, this is not a religion, because we are so passionate and we know that it works. I mean, naturopathic medicine works, right? We would not do what we did if it did not work. But there's just some scenarios that we may need to use
Yeah.
those things. And so can you share about how are we what we call vitalist naturopathic doctors, and where does that fit in with crisis care? Where does that fit together?
Vitalism is a term that our mentors, you and my mentors, and some of the old traditional naturopaths used, and thankfully some continue to use, that believes that the body in its state of vitality or being fully alive and in a state of resiliency, being able to stay in that strong, centered, fully aliveness despite the happenings around us, that in that state of vital resiliency, that we can be in such a state of health that it obliges wonderment by those who looking on, that we can use this healthy vessel that we live in to accomplish our greatest purposes on this planet in such a way that people look at you and they're like, what does she have, or what does he
What is
have?
he
I want
taking?
that.
Right.
And so the
Yeah.
paradigm, I think, is what's the most important, because there are naturopathic doctors, osteopathic doctors, lots of different clinicians who
Mhm.
are like, oh,
Mhm.
you have insomnia, maybe you need turmeric and B vitamins and melatonin, and they just give you the herb.
Right.
But a vitalist will say,
Yep.
what are these symptoms of insomnia or anxiety or whatever? What are they telling me needs healing, and how? So our symptoms, the definition
Mhm.
of symptoms is profoundly different to a vitalist. In conventional medicine, a symptom is a sign of suffering that we want to suppress. The doctor wants to relieve suffering. I want them to relieve suffering too. But if we put a
Mhm.
semicolon there and we say, yes, they're suffering, but what is this suffering tells me needs healing and how? Then we're into vitalism. And that's what
Mhm.
makes it profoundly different. And so when we talk about crisis management, the number one thing that we want to make sure that we do as healers is to do no harm. And so if somebody is in a crisis, if somebody is they're in a trauma activation, they're having a nervous breakdown, they're hemorrhaging, they have a raging infection that isn't going away, whatever it is, they're crisis, you name it,
Mhm.
then it is our duty to relieve suffering as quickly as possible. And then while we're doing that, then we do all of the foundational stuff. So in your story, and my story also, actually, Susan, is that
Exactly.
you were in such horrible pain. I remember we talked about medications for pain. I'm like, taking turmeric is not doing it, girl. Like, taking white willow bark is not
No.
doing it.
Just
Magnesium
search it.
L-threonate is not
Not
touching
touching
it. So
it.
it's like a squirt bottle of water in a forest fire. That's a yellow light symptom treatment when you're like beyond red light, right? And
Oh,
you're not going to get better,
absolutely.
because when you're in pain, the body is in autonomic arousal. It's in fight, flight, freeze. And when we are in a
Mhm.
state of sympathetic activation in fight, flight, freeze like that, that's not the state that the body will do its healing in. You have to calm the body first. So you needed an acute intervention. When
Absolutely.
I wasn't sleeping, I ended up taking benzodiazepines, and I wish I would have done it sooner,
Yep.
because it helped me get out of that
Yeah.
crisis state. It gave me a tool that reliably worked to help me be able to do the deeper work of what the heck is going on here? What are these symptoms telling me about? And so I think that if you have a doctor, and this, ooh, I could go on, but
I know, I know. That's like the green allopathy
mhm,
model of like that's like when you said, I remember there was a professor in school who said, "What's wrong with green allopathy because that's safer?" Well, while it's great to palliate someone with natural things to help them out of something, right? Some people are not in the crisis that I was in where theanine is enough, right? But is theanine the root cause of why they have the anxiety? Why do they have that? And so using green allopathy, in my perspective, and I'm sure the same for you, we're no different than a medical doctor for giving you a pharmaceutical for a symptom, right? So while it could be safer for symptom management, we're not addressing the why. There's no what's the cause
yeah,
here. right? And so I think there are a lot of naturopaths that do treat that way, but how far do we get, right? Like how far do you get when you're only treating symptoms
When
with natural items?
I think about the
So now
level
I
of vital resiliency and matching it up with that, because I have seen, because it's as you're saying, I want to echo what you're saying for those listening, because I see the nuance
yeah,
in here, and it's not about the treatment, but the way the treatment is being prescribed
yes,
and the person who's receiving the treatment. So if somebody
mm,
has done
yes,
all of the work and they have all of the resources, but something's out of whack, maybe they have MTHFR and they just don't have enough methyl factors, but they've done all of the other things.
mhm,
Their diet is pristine, their habits are pristine. And then you give them a methylated B vitamin to help with their then suddenly their depression is gone because now they can make serotonin correctly. So
mhm,
when as you're listening
mhm,
to this, I want to
mhm.
make sure that you're hearing that nuance. And I love the name of your podcast, Modern Day Naturopath, because you're using ancient wisdom with modern research, with the wisdom that we have now. So
Exactly.
wanted to echo that.
Exactly. Exactly. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And also when you shared before about, you know, let's talk about benzos and the drug that, and I'll be completely transparent, I ended up on Valium for, oh my goodness, maybe a year, maybe a year and a half. But I think, and I was going to share this later, but this is so important. What was the most profound part of healing through all of this was that I learned from Dr. Nicole how I can use these and come off of them. It was not like, take this and this is going to band-aid you for the next X. This is going to get your nervous system in a place where you could start healing, because the emotional and the physical pain were so debilitating that, like we said, the herbs weren't touching it. And so I remember the first night I was so scared because I hadn't taken those drugs since I was in my 20s, and I, was so nervous to do it again. I remember being like, asking her like to hold my hand through like taking, a Valium. And I remember I had that night's sleep was like the best night's sleep of my life after not sleeping 3 days. And so we also use, and actually before we talked about all the holistic things we did beside that, can you just share why you chose that drug as a drug that you felt was one that I should choose versus
Yeah,
something else at that time? And I know everyone's different, but what was your, if you can remember back then?
your symptoms were like all day and all night. And so it wasn't like you got the
Mhm.
Sunday scaries, or you just got nervous driving over a bridge, or you had a really important meeting you were nervous about. This was like, in this
Yeah.
crisis,
Mhm.
that autonomic arousal and pain was all day and all night. And so with benzodiazepines, the drugs work by increasing GABA bioavailability. And GABA is a chemical
Mhm.
that our bodies use to calm action potentials, to calm the nervous system, to calm the brain. And that can reduce pain, it can reduce anxiety, can help us sleep. But there are different kinds. And so there are really short acting ones. And so some of those may be like Xanax or Ativan or um, alprazolam, lorazepam.
Mhm.
And so then the person would take it, and then you would have this huge spike of GABA, and then it would come out of your system. Or there are longer acting, Valium or diazepam is an example of that, maybe Klonopin or clonazepam. But if somebody is in a state of acute crisis all day long, instead of having them take it multiple times a day, where then they get spikes and crashes and spikes and crashes, if we can attain just a consistent level in the system, then it's going to be less difficult to get off of in the long run. And so this is largely, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so a lot of this comes from the Ashton method. There's a ton of free information about the Ashton method online. And Dr. Ashton would teach, if you're on a short acting benzodiazepine, it will be easier for most people to taper off of a long one. So she would help people switch from short acting to long acting so the taper is easier. So for you,
Mhm.
I didn't want you spiking
Mhm.
and crashing all day long. And
That makes
yeah, and then we
complete
wanted to get off of
sense.
it. The ultimate goal is to get off of it.
Yeah, wait, right. That wasn't absolutely. So, what did we also do beside the pharmaceutical intervention as naturopaths to help? So, the thing that I remember the most was there were so many things, but I remember first starting with actual trauma work. So, for example, EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, that I have to say was the most helpful specific trauma therapy I think I've done. I'd love to hear your experience if you'd agree, but I remember going in there with like a 15 out of 10 migraine, and I came out like I think by the next day it was like the pain went down to about like a 5, and I remember saying it feels like a demon literally left my brain after the EMDR, and I didn't know what to expect. I was very scared, and I remember the EMDR therapist would not do EMDR right away with me, and I'm like, "Well, I'm here for EMDR." And he would be like, "Okay, but," and he drew me the island of safety on a piece of paper, and he's like, "Well, we have to get you to this island of safety." And I'm like, "Well, I'm a New Yorker. I'm like fast. I'm like, I'm here for EMDR, and you're not doing." I remember calling my mom, and I'm like, "I think he's taking my money. I think he's trying to keep me there. I just want to do EMDR." And now, like looking back, like how silly was I? And I'm sharing that specifically because I even tell my patients if they do not start EMDR, you want to make sure you're in a very safe nervous system place because you will recall memories, right? And I always say it's not the purpose of recalling those memories is not to re-traumatize you, it's to help you process them. But in the same breath, it could be disturbing. That's why I would always literally put an EMDR night on my calendar where no one call, no one come bother me. It's like that was like the solitude night to be able to process all of those memories, right? So I did several of those. I remember because we came out of medical school, none of us had any money. We had like barely any insurance. I think I was on government insurance at the time, and I found an EMDR therapist in Harlem, uptown New York City, and I drove 1 hour from Queens to go to this guy because he took my insurance, and I went to him twice a week. And that's the power of I want to get better. Like I didn't care that it took me an hour and I was driving uptown and I didn't know where to park and I didn't care. I'm like, I have someone taking my insurance because that's not even, no one does that. Like there's no EMDR therapists anymore that actually do that. And so I utilized that. And that was I would say one of the biggest parts of healing the I would say the triggers. And listen, I'm still healing and I still can get triggered, but there's intensities and charges, right? Like it takes the charge down. I can actually talk. I would never have been able to get on a podcast and talk about this without then having insomnia for 4 days, right? So I'd love to hear your experience with EMDR specifically or any other type of trauma therapy. But I think that had just as much as an effect with you,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
That
And
was
I
wonderful,
later went and now I'm trained.
right?
I'm formally trained in EMDR. Yeah.
I know, I love it. I know. I've done it with Dr. Nicole
Yeah,
too.
and
She's
we do
amazing.
it's kind of like a smorgasbord of EMDR, like traditional 8
Mhm,
phase EMDR, but then we put in a little bit of ego state work. And so to sort of distill out what those mean
mhm.
is EMDR was created by Francine Shapiro in the 1980s, and as you said it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, and it's built on the premise that stress, overwhelm, trauma, adversity doesn't always get stored in logical verbal parts of the brain and body. And so Bessel van der Kolk talked a lot about this in his trailblazing book The Body Keeps the Score. And so when we're trying to use top down or logical treatments to heal things that don't have access to that, we're going to feel like we're hitting our heads against the wall. And a lot of
Mhm.
your trauma was stored in your nervous system. You have nervous system anxiety. So you'd have the headaches, you'd have the burning brain, you'd have the insomnia. And so the logical top
Mhm.
down talk therapy, cognitive behavioral approaches weren't getting to those parts of the body storing all of that. And so EMDR is a tool that certain clinicians are trained in to help us access that. And then ego state is the
Mhm.
perfect example of ego state is what you described that person telling you to do. It's like find your 5-year-old, squat down, get on your knees, look her in the eyes and ask her why your head hurts. That's ego state. And what's so cool about that is that it can bypass so much theorizing and wandering and following trauma triggers and going
Yeah.
down into the rabbit hole. You just ask that part and the body keeps a score. Those parts remember things that you may not remember now. And so I love ego state for that. It's more commonly popularized as IFS or internal family systems.
Oh, is that actually what I've never really understood I've always heard my psychologist now, she does internal family systems, but I never really quite understood what that is and what you okay, so you're saying there's a correlation between ego state work and that's what IFS is. I always try I never quite
Yeah.
understood what they were trying to like what was the
Yeah.
purpose of
And I
that.
do want to
Okay.
validate
That
you as remember you were talking about like, what are we going to get to the bilateral processing part of EMDR? Why are we going to an island? Is that's phase where's this
Where's this
island and how
island?
do I get a ticket? Phase 2 of EMDR is called effective tolerance building. And so it's sort of like building your liver supports before you ask the liver to detox is where we're
Mhm.
building your resources so that when you're doing the emotional detox and the EMDR and the IFS is that you have the stability to lean back on. So I want to validate you.
Yes.
You were doing the EMDR. He just didn't tell you that.
I know that's what he said. He was like, "This is EMDR," and I was like, ugh, I was rolling my eyes. I'm like, "Okay, this is not EMDR." And he's like, "We just need you to be able to have that place to hold on to when you start to," and it was interesting because then we would do the EMDR and then I would feel myself. He's like, I think you're like, he could see me and I could feel myself for the first time disassociating. He's like, okay, like you're not in the, like, you're like, let's like look around the room. Like, here's a pillow, touch the pillow, get your feet on the ground because the memories that were coming up, it's a lot, especially when you didn't remember all of this, right? And now you're kind of like forced to face it, or you've chosen to face it. So that's another part. And I would say that type of work, the somatic therapy, was huge part of my own healing. I've done a lot of shamans and energy healers. I love all the things energy medicine. And another thing that I remember distinctly was because Dr. Nicole is a wizard of homeopathic remedies, she would prescribe me the best homeopathics. I remember when I was what we would call like scared shitless, like I would take aconite, like my panic remedy, like, it's like, oh, but it also, what the great thing about homeopathy is, and I know you could share more about this, is that it's really like a really good remedy is helping not only your physical symptoms but your as well as your mental symptoms. So she would find like aconite was a very distinct burning remedy, right? So it would help quell some of that acid feeling in my brain that I was having, but also that terror feeling, right? But then all of a sudden I might shift in, and this is where it would get difficult sometimes because, it's like, okay, now you want to make sure you stay in touch with your naturopath and you want to make sure you have enough appointments booked because you may go out of those remedy states. And we would go through all different remedies as my body was processing from arsenicum, right? I thought I'm never going to get better, right? The arsenicum, everything's going to make me sick. Nothing's going to get better. And I would say, would you say remedies? I remember this. You told me I would shift out of remedies like every day. You would shift that. You told me you were taking Ruz Toxicondrion, Ruz Tox for literally, I think you said 2 years, or did I make that up? It was something
That's the last
ridiculously
remedy I
long.
took, and I was prescribed it in 2015.
Are you? So
I
you've been
take
on
it
that
as
since?
needed, which is really rarely. So yeah, I've been on it since PRN. Yeah, as needed. Yeah.
Oh my god. So would you say that homeopathy was a huge part of your own healing, which made you so Dr. Nicole, her specialty is homeopathy, mental health, and she loves a good mental health case where she can find a remedy and break that, break that cycle of what someone's going through. So did you notice a remedy like rocked your world and you're like, I have to help people? I remember you were on shifts. I think you were on like every
Yeah.
homeopathy shift,
Yeah.
right? In medical school. What about homeopathy was so intriguing that you said, I have to do this mostly? Because that's what you do with your patients. It's mostly your main modality. I mean, I know you use other things as well, but you would say that's your like main modality that
I
you're using.
fell in love with it before I knew how it was so ostracized by the medical community. I had no idea. I went into naturopathic school like unbiased. I was like, "Ah, this sounds amazing." And I found homeopathy, and what turned me onto it is I had this friend who I met in the symphony. I was singing in the symphony, and it was
Oh
really
my God.
fun. Yeah.
Really? You're
Yeah, the
singing in a
Phoenix
symphony?
Symphony,
Oh,
and I met this girl, and she was
oh
so
my
sweet,
God.
and I learned over time that she had debilitating Crohn's disease, and so for your listeners, that's
Oh
a
my gosh.
horrible gastrointestinal disease, and that started when she got married, and they had taken out part of her bowels. She was on a lot of medications, and she wasn't getting better. They told her she probably would never have kids, and she was just so sad. Spent most of her days laying on the bathroom floor next to the toilet. And so I was like, well, you've tried everything, including surgery. Maybe this homeopathy thing I'm doing it could help. This doctor that I'm shadowing seems to really believe in
Mhm.
it. And so she was like, okay. She came on the student shift. I was a Q5, so I was in the beginning of my second, wait, 4 quarters were in our year, right? It's like been so long. I don't
Oh my god, I don't even know. I think so. I know, I
It's a
think so. That was
blur.
such a
It
blur. Yes,
was so this is
I think.
probably like in 2008 or 2009, I don't remember. And she came in, we spent 3 hours gathering her symptoms from mental emotional symptoms to the physical symptoms of Crohn's and anything else that was going on. We
You were
looked at her whole symptom picture, mental emotional symptoms, physical symptoms. We spent hours with her, and then we ended up giving her a remedy called Natrimer. And then when she came back in 30 days later, her symptoms were gone. And I was like,
you were like,
I
"This
was like,
is
what?
what is this
I was like, this
magic?"
is,
I know you wanted it to work, but then when it worked, you're like,
and a
"Really?"
lot of people are like, oh, well, it's a placebo. And I'm like, well, if that's the power of a placebo, count me in.
Then
And
I right, then I'll do this all day,
yeah, and
every
I'm
day.
still friends with this girl, and she has a teenage daughter now and is living her best life. She doesn't satisfy the criteria for Crohn's disease
No
anymore.
way. Oh my god, how
Yeah.
incredible is that? So that's the power of
Hmm.
homeopathy, and if you have the right remedy, it can literally change your life, right? So we have EMDR and all the somatic work and that ego state work and the parts work, and then we have the energy medicine, and then we have beautiful things like magnesium and theanine. And at the time you had your, was it, I think it was called Happy
Yes.
Sleepy powder to help with yeah, so Dr. Cain had this really awesome mix to help while you were taking the benzo so that you would help support your GABA. So when you do try to come off, right, you're not in this place of crisis trying to come off. And if you want to share a little bit about your kind of powder combination and why you give that to
The
patients.
Ashton method is a purist method, and I think she created and updated it maybe 2012 if I'm getting my dates correctly. And so she didn't
Mhm,
have the information that we have now in the research about
mhm,
what's actually happening in the brain when we're giving these amino acids. And I think of these amino acids as a GABA bridge. And so if you're imagining that you're on a post and you're trying to jump from your post to a
mhm,
post that's 2 feet away, some
mhm.
people can jump that far, others of us can't. And so the space between
Yeah.
posts, it is representative of the gap in GABA between what you had and what your body is making as is trying to compensate for the drop in your benzo dosage. And so if we can connect a bridge between posts using amino acids to help you make your own GABA and to give you a little bit of GABA, it will make that taper down process on the benzos a lot easier and smoother. And so it,
Which it did,
yes,
right? It did. It like actually
it's
did.
the best thing ever. And you can buy all these ingredients at your local health food store. So I call it happy sleepy powder because I mix them all together and it makes me happy and sleepy. And so you can, I have it online. You can get the instructions on how to use it online.
Do you have it on your you sell it
I
on your
do.
website? Okay, good. What's your website again? It is
drnicolecain.com.
Awesome. You can get your happy
Yeah.
sleepy powder and you'll share with them like how
Yeah.
much to
If you
take with
If you go
each.
to
Okay.
drnicolecain.com and just type in the search bar happy sleepy powder, you'll find a blog about it that explains it. There's a
You'll
link
find
to
it.
buy it. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So we have access to that. And then also Dr. Cain makes beautiful tinctures. She made me, I think, oh my God, I have so many in my house. There's like the brain, oh, I don't even know. One of them you called something that was, Dr. Sensitive used to do that. He wouldn't really put what's in it. He would just put like happy, or he would put, because a lot of people were like, well, what's in this? And then they're researching it and it would just like ruin that dynamic, right? So I remember getting all of these custom blends. And that's the beauty of naturopathic medicine, where we are able to realize that there was a pharmaceutical need, but we are certainly not going to stop doing all the other things to help, because we know that the long-term usage of benzos and these medications can be very dangerous and have side effects long-term. So the other thing I wanted to mention was, would you say, if you had to say what would be the perfect recipe for someone, and I know this is so hard to answer because everyone's different, but if you had to pick, like, whether it be one supplement blend, one herbal, one particular trauma therapy, based on your experience and how effective they have been, what would you say is like your perfect kind of multifaceted approach to your own healing of trauma and for patients trying to heal their trauma?
I think you're like asking me to go.
I know, it's so hard. I was like, I know you're.
It's like going into a room full of puppies and being told I can only have one.
I know. I try to pick
I,
one. Like, what? Let's say for your own life, what has been the top 3 to 5 things that have shifted you and helped you heal from your trauma?
EMDR and EMDR and the spiritual piece, because I think a lot of it for me was spiritual trauma. So doing spiritual work, EMDR work, and I think the other biggest thing for me was removing the obstacle to cure. And where I was in my life at that time was, I believe, a causal factor behind what happened to me. And I think that's often omitted. So we have this great book called What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah. So they talk about all the things that happened to us and what we can do with respect to that. But I think that it's just as important as to think about what didn't happen that we need.
Yes.
And
Right. I'll never forget what you just said. I never forget. I remember a friend saying to me one day, I said, I wonder what happened to that friend of ours for her to have gone through. And she goes, no, Susan, I think there, like, something didn't happen to her. And when she said that, it's what didn't happen to her, that really struck me, because you always are like, what did happen to people? But there's a lot of stuff that they didn't go through that are causing those things, right?
Like, I didn't get a lot of my needs met in terms of just feeling loved, valued, respected. I wasn't getting those needs met, and that causes suffering. So if you're listening to this conversation and you're like, what can I add or what can I take? It's like, yes, add good things. The therapeutic order, which naturopaths use or vitalists use to kind of create the dream treatment sheet. And one of those is obstacles to cure. So what is in your life, whether it's a medication or a supplement or a person or a job
Right.
or a climate or a socioeconomic status or marginalization or discrimination, whatever that is, what is an obstacle to cure for you, and where can you take some of the power back to mitigate that?
Absolutely. And also, do you feel that some people who haven't even been through what maybe certain traumas, like not going through those adversities, have also, right? Think of the learning lessons that we have learned and the people we are today because of what we have gone through. And some people maybe have not gone through that stuff, right? And so I think it's also important because some people say, oh, well, nothing really happened that I can remember that was traumatic, but maybe the lack of it having anything to work through, because I don't know about you, that is what kind of, that's where that spiritual part comes in with. That's, I feel, where you're ending up connecting with God the most, or connecting with your spiritual power the most, is through, going through something so devastating, right? So I think a lot of connections are being made there. So I do want to just close with maybe you can just share a little bit for people who don't understand why, and I know you shared a little bit about this before, but the importance of understanding that if you have done all of these physical things for your body and you have not gotten to a resolution, that trauma can be that one thing, just like in my case, right? I truly feel I would have been in a wheelchair by now if I did not do that trauma work while I'm still healing. And if I look back 5 years, I don't have those insomnia. Like, I have, like, when's the last time I sent you an SOS message? Maybe a year ago, right? It's not as often. It's usually like she knows when it's like she knows it's bad if it's like an SOS message. So if we look back, I just want to share with you guys the importance of understanding that there are these physical manifestations, and you seeing that in a lot of your patients too, that they have this trauma that they may not remember, and then they end up then having X, Y, and Z symptoms.
I want to put like a slight caveat to that, in that I think maybe for people, at least with my patients, is I tell them to worry less about what did or did not happen, but rather what is coming up for you.
Right.
And I think we have this desire to create meaning out of it. So like, I feel this way because of X, Y, and Z. This must have happened to me, or this mustn't have happened to me. But rather, if we just allow ourselves to relinquish our need to understand and control, our need for our analytical brain to try to fix everything, and just allow our body, because it could be speaking in metaphor. And so you may have this like image come into your mind of a dog chasing you, but maybe it's like you feeling like you're in danger because of the economic crisis, and you feel like they're going to come after you, but it presents in the image of a dog. So I think that as you're listening to this recording is just acknowledge with an open mind what's coming up for you, and then allow it to direct you towards what needs healing and how, whether that's through supplements or EMDR or herbs or yoga or going to a shaman, whatever that is, personalize it to you.
Exactly. And even just really quick aside about what you just said, I remember the therapist said, it doesn't matter. You don't need to remember the details. Even if the details wasn't actually what happened, your nervous system thinks that that's what you still need to process that. And it's not so much, you don't have to remember all those nitty gritty details to get well and to heal. And I wanted to share some resources that Dr. Cain does have to help people overcoming their, maybe, they got on a benzodiazepine from a crisis situation like we talked about right now, and that was the thing that helped them. But I want you to share a little bit more about the resources that you have for people, that you have your new book, which I'm so excited. I just literally had a friend here and we just were like, she's like, did you pre-order Nicole's book? I'm like, duh, I did that like right when it came out. So Dr. Tate was just saying she's like, of course I pre-ordered her book. We're so excited. So share a little bit about your book, where we can find you, where we can get a tapering benzo course or any courses around mental health, nervous system work.
Yeah, come find me on Instagram. That's where everything is always up to date. I hang out with brilliant people like you, Dr. Sue. And with the book coming out this fall, there's going to be a lot of freebies. Like you buy the book, you get this freebie. There's so much fun stuff that's happening. I have a holistic wellness collective. So I used to have a bunch of courses and I felt like it was just too many things for people to buy and it was getting expensive. And so I just wanted to put it all in one place, and it's in the membership. So the membership is kind of like a giant warehouse of information, algorithms, videos, recipes. You have access to testing and supplements at discounts and access to me and my team. You can get your questions answered. So everything is there. I do have a separate courses because that's just like a giant beast of its own. So there's a preparing for a benzodiazepine course that you can work with your doctor. But if you're just like, I want to learn all of the things, the membership collective at the Instagram bio is like my fave.
You put everything into, I knew you had all these beautiful courses. I didn't know you put all of them into the Holistic Wellness Collective. That is so exciting. And also, you didn't tell us the name of your book, did you?
Panic Proof. Panic Proof, the problem and the solution in a 2-word alliteration.
It is the most brilliant title, because who doesn't want to be panic-proofed?
I sure want to be panic-proofed. I was like, whoa, I needed this book like a decade ago.
I know, right? Especially after the last 4 years. So we can find Dr. Nicole Cain on Instagram at Dr. Nicole Cain, DrNicoleCain. And also you can find her in the Holistic Wellness Collective. Pre-order her book, Panic Proof. And I am so grateful to have you. This is we could have talked. We have to have you again because we can go into so many different areas. We just touched briefly, if you can even imagine, on these topics. But there's so much more. So I would love to hear your feedback, what you guys think, what else you want to learn about. And thank you so much for being such a pivotal part of my healing. If I did not have you, I do not know where I would be, honestly. And it makes me super emotional. So to have you as my first podcast guest, knowing how special you were to me, from the teaching you gave me and to the help you gave me overcoming my own trauma, I'm forever, eternally grateful.
It's such an honor, my love. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Modern Day Naturopath Podcast with Dr. Sue.